Hi, my name's LindsayMoore. Today I've chosen the topic of election integrity. It's really become a really big issue, especially as we get closer to our presidential election this year. Uh, there's been a real big push for many states to move to all uh, vote-in ballot system for this upcoming presidential election, and I think people are really concerned about the consequences of that. And I think it's fair to ask what the risks are and the consequences of making such a drastic move. And I just wanted to explore those questions and ask if it's reasonable that citizens in this country should be concerned with election fraud in general. Many times when this subject is brought up, it's pretty much dismissed as kind of crazy talk. That voter fraud, in particular, happens at such a low rate or in such rare cases that it's not something that we should really be concerned with. Unfortunately, and as I was doing this research, I found that not to be completely true. And I think my concern, and that of most Americans, is not just with this new push for vote by mail due to the pandemic, but the security of the process as a whole, regardless of the platform that we choose for voting. I think that there's been a number of issues over the years. Some main ones would be groups that lobby against security measures as simple as voter ID checks or ID checks at polling centers. This is often touted as voter suppression. I've heard the arguments for that. Personally, nobody's ever presented an argument to me that has convinced me that having to prove who you are by using a state-issued ID is a form of voter suppression. There's also some other issues of cleaning up voter registration rolls. There's been lots of pushes to allow illegal immigrants to vote in elections, and even reversal of laws that used to keep felons from voting. Some states are now allowing not just felons to vote, but are pushing to allow people that are currently in prison to vote, which I found pretty shocking. So I just did a quick search of news headlines, and you can see just when I put this quick search in that there's a lot of concern about a mail-in system for this upcoming election and what the consequences of that might be. People are concerned, and I think rightfully so. I think that it's right to ask questions and be concerned about that kind of process. I hadn't really touched too much on actual election fraud cases, but I did find that the Heritage Foundation has a really good database that is not comprehensive. It's not every instance of voter fraud in the country, and as it says here, it is a sampling of recent election fraud cases. And while it's not showing you everything that's happening, I think it does exactly what it's intended to do, and just as it says on their website here, is to demonstrate the vulnerabilities in the election system and in many ways in which the fraud is committed. In addition to diluting the votes of legitimate voters, fraud can have an impact in close elections, and we have many close elections in our country. This was a very interesting website. I found it interesting. I clicked around on some of the cases, read some of the situations and scenarios where people attempted to commit voter fraud, and some of it was quite elaborate and went on for years. So it was kind of surprising. It's worth checking out, just so you can get an idea of how people go about committing these kinds of fraud. I'm not sure why that went to that already, but okay. It's something worth checking out. It was interesting. Okay, so I have a couple of videos that I wanted to play, and this was one. I think the two that I'm going to show you do a really good job of speaking out about some of the issues that we face with regard to election integrity. And there's some really interesting statistics, some disturbing, and some major areas of concern. So I'm going to go ahead and play the video.
While the major media fixates on the influence of foreign powers on American elections, a much more serious attack has been taking place right under our noses. Good old-fashioned, homegrown voter fraud. Let's look at 3 of the worst offenses. Example number 1, bloated voter rolls. In 244 counties across the United States, there are more registered voters than there are people legally eligible to vote. 29 states have counties with more registered voters than legal residents, and 8 states have more registered voters than actual voting age people. When the Supreme Court upheld Ohio's efforts to clean up its own voter rolls in 2018, the majority opinion cited Pew Center statistics. 24 million voter registrations in the United States are either invalid or significantly inaccurate, and nearly 3 million people are believed to be registered to vote in more than one state. These numbers have a shocking implication. It's very easy to exploit our voting system. During an undercover investigation, New York City detectives made 63 attempts to cast illegal ballots based on flawed voter rolls. They were successful 61 times. Similar investigations in other cities and other states produced the same dismal results. But phony voters on the rolls is just one threat to election integrity. Here's example number 2, ballot harvesting. In 2016, the state of California, one of the states with more registered voters than citizens, became the first state to legalize the practice of ballot solicitation. That is, the collection and delivery of ballots by third parties. With no trace of irony, this is called ballot harvesting. It works like this. In California, organizations with a clear political agenda are legally permitted to go to a location, say a nursing home or a church, and collect, literally harvest, ballots. The third party then transports these ballots to a polling place or an election office. This raises an obvious question. Once this third party collects the ballots, what's to stop them from changing them, or from just throwing out the ones they don't like? A guilty conscience? How do we know ballot harvesters from Democratic organizations aren't destroying Republican ballots? Or Republican harvesters aren't destroying Democratic ballots? We don't. We have no way of knowing. Let's look at one specific example. On election night in 2018, California's Central Valley Republican Congressman David Valadao held a 5,000 vote lead over his challenger, Democrat TJ Cox. The margin was wide enough that the networks even called to race for Valadao, the Republican incumbent. But wait, there were late ballots still to be delivered by the third-party vote harvesters. When those votes came in, they broke so overwhelmingly for Cox, in a historically conservative district no less, that Valadao's 5,000 vote victory became an 862 vote loss. Maybe that was just a coincidence. Or maybe not. In the first major election after ballot harvesting was allowed in California, Democrats won every single congressional seat in Orange County, which had been a Republican stronghold for decades. A year earlier, no sober person would have thought that possible. Voter corruption example number 3, voting by non-citizens. Should you have to be a citizen to vote? Silly question, right? It was once, not anymore. According to a recent poll, more than half of Democrats, 53%, support granting illegal immigrants the right to vote. Forget the legal ones. Democratic National Chair Tom Perez, before working for the Obama administration, worked for a group called Casa de Maryland, which has been a longtime advocate for expanding non-citizen voting rights. Yes, it's true that federal law prohibits non-citizens from voting in federal elections, but 11 states, all run by Democrats, currently allow non-citizen voting of some kind. Cities such as Chicago and San Francisco, for example, allow non-citizens to vote in certain citywide elections. Why? Because for progressives, demography is destiny, and many see illegal immigrants as future voters. So there you have it, 3 different ways to tamper with the vote. Bloated voter rolls, ballot harvesting, voting by non-citizens. These are just 3 ways in which the left creates a clear advantage for itself on election day. The major media will tell you that corrupt voting practices either don't exist or are so minor they don't matter. But to believe that, you have to believe 2 things. That voter registration rolls are accurate and secure from fraudulent registrations, and that no one is trying to manipulate the results for political purposes. Those are 2 very big leaps. Maybe you want to make those leaps because you like the results they produce. But if you care about free and fair elections, no matter which party you belong to, you need to pay attention. Or pretty soon, free and fair elections will be a quaint relic of the past. No foreign government can undermine our democracy, but Americans can, and some do. I'm Eric Eggers, investigative reporter for the Government Accountability Institute for Prager University.
Okay, so I thought that was a pretty good video. I thought it was pretty enlightening.
Video was made possible.
I actually, before watching that video, had never heard of ballot harvesting before, and was quite shocked that it was something that was actually legal. And not only is it legal in California, as it was mentioned in that video, ballot harvesting, which allows professional campaign operatives and political activists to have access to absentee ballots and authority to recruit voters, is allowed in 27 states and the District of Columbia. I do think that this is a practice that should make all Americans take pause. It's just wrong, if you ask me. I do have this second short video, might be slightly redundant. It does talk about election integrity issues that might have been covered a little bit in the previous video. But the presenter also outlines ways that we can start improving the process and cleaning it up.
In the freest nation in the world, our system of government and our very liberty depend on free and fair elections. Whether they're selecting a mayor or the President of the United States, every American must be able to trust the process or the democratic system itself breaks down. When someone commits voter fraud, the process is no longer fair. Everyone's vote gets diluted, and in some cases, election results are changed. Contrary to the claims of many on the left, voter fraud is a very real problem. As the Supreme Court noted when it upheld Indiana's voter ID law, flagrant examples of voter fraud have been documented throughout this nation's history. The National Commission on Federal Election Reform has said that in many close elections, fraud can absolutely change the outcome. Cases of local elections getting overturned because of fraud have occurred in New Jersey, Indiana, and many other states. Although the Heritage Foundation's voter fraud database has detailed cases of hundreds of people who've been convicted in recent years, the fact is voter fraud often goes undetected. And even when it's discovered, overburdened prosecutors rarely prioritize these cases. Fraudsters can steal votes and change election outcomes in several ways, including voting in someone else's name, registering in multiple locations to vote multiple times in the same election, voting even though they're not eligible because they're felons or they're non-citizens, or paying or intimidating people to vote for certain candidates. Unfortunately, many on the left are attempting to make election fraud easier by fighting laws that require an ID to vote. They've pushed to get non-citizens and jailed inmates to vote. And they've sued states that have tried to purge their voter rolls of people registered in multiple states. How can we fix the problem? Well, since states control much of the electoral process, they must pass laws requiring government-issued IDs to vote. That ensures people aren't stealing others' identities and their
Sorry.
sued states that have tried to purge their voter rolls of people registered in multiple states. How can we fix the problem? Well, since states control much of the electoral process, they must pass laws requiring government-issued IDs to vote. That ensures people aren't stealing others' identities and their right to vote. States also should join voter registration cross-check programs to identify voters registered in multiple places. One cross-check program has identified hundreds of thousands of potential duplicate registrations across 30 states, as well as evidence of illegal double voting. States should also compare voter rolls with government records to identify convicted felons and non-citizens who should be removed from the rolls. And the federal government should cooperate with these efforts and make Department of Homeland Security and other databases available to state officials. Preserving this great experiment that is America depends on having free and fair elections where all Americans can trust the process and the results. Something as critical as election integrity can't be left to a simple honor system. One of the most important roles of government is to safeguard the electoral process and ensure that every voter's right to cast a ballot is protected. That not only protects our right to vote, that's how we protect the future of our very republic.
Okay, so I thought that was a pretty good video that showed and outlined things that we can do that would really substantially improve our election integrity just by cleaning up voter rolls alone and having cross checks through various government agencies. I did want to quickly just touch back on the mail-in voting. Mail-in voting is not something new, or nor is it new to consider it as a mean way of casting votes. The idea didn't just arise out of the pandemic. 5 states already use this form of voting for all elections: Colorado, Hawaii, Oregon, Utah, and Washington. Oregon being the oldest, I think they had started mail in voting in 2000. The process, though, was not easy for these states to get there. There was a lot of legwork to try to clean up, verify IDs or verify addresses and identifications. They're still plagued with a lot of problems. I will mention that I have had personal experience with mail-in voting. I did live in Oregon for a couple of years, and yes, I find that mail-in voting was extremely convenient. My ballot arrived in my mailbox. I opened it up. I sat on the couch. I looked through it. If there were people or issues that I wasn't completely familiar with, I had time to research those issues or those people, and make maybe a more informed decision. Another positive aspect about mail-in voting is that there is a higher voter turnout. Obviously, if you don't have to worry about trying to make it to a poll, you're going to have more people that vote. And I think probably people might feel more comfortable voting if they feel like they have the time to take a look at the ballot and try to make an actual informed decision instead of showing up at a poll and not really knowing what the issues are. I have this article here that was written by the same gentleman who just did the presentation in the previous video. This is also from the Heritage Foundation. It's a really, really good article, and it talks about the problems with mail-in voting, and then absentee and mail-in ballots. And not only does he talk about the issues with that, but then goes on to list 4 cases in which elections were affected by voter fraud. It's a really interesting read. I encourage you to take the time to go read through the whole thing. I just took a few things that really I thought were poignant from the article. So the first one was that mail-in ballots make illegal vote buying easier. The buyer can ensure that the voter is voting the way that they are paid to vote. They say it's something that can't happen at a polling place, and I would assume that's generally true, but I mean, anything's possible. If you're getting paid, then I don't see, if somebody's willing to take money for a vote, then they're probably going to vote the way that they've been asked to. Then the second one, analysis of reports filed by the U.S. Elections Assistance Commission, the EAC, on the 2012, 2014, 2016, and 2018 elections. More than 28 million mail-in ballots effectively disappeared. Their fate is listed as unknown. These are surveys sent to the EAC by state election officials. 28 million mail-in votes just disappeared. They are not accounted for at all. Another report states that 1.3 million completed absentee mail-in and mail-in ballots were rejected for a number of reasons, including signature mismatches. This is 1.3 million votes that just aren't going to be counted. It's not as if these officials go back to the voter and try to clear up the issue. They're simply just disregarded. They're thrown in the trash can, essentially. States such as Washington and Oregon that have mail-in elections have very similar problems. According to reports, the past 4 federal elections, Oregon listed more than 170,000 ballots as undeliverable, 29,000 ballots as rejected, and 871,737 ballots as unknown. And I think those are pretty staggering numbers. Those are millions of votes that just, we don't know what happened to them. So in this last slide, I wanted to talk about, after reading and watching these videos about election integrity in general, it's really not hard for anyone to ask if a last minute effort to change the majority of vote casting to a mail in system would be clean, fair, and free. Uh, this is a system that's already plagued with so many vulnerabilities, and it's kind of a scary proposition to think about states that have never ever endeavored to implement a mail-in voting system, and to imagine they would suddenly have the infrastructure, machines, the resources, and all of this while ensuring the security of the process in just merely months. And I don't think it's just asking too much. I think it's inviting disaster. And I do really have a sincere fear that this election year will see widespread voter fraud and could likely turn our presidential election into a nightmare that will be a damaging blow to our democracy. The mere appearance of an unfair election, it will throw this country into chaos even more than we already are seeing now. Although, yeah, you have to remember, not all is lost. There's one thing that we can't forget, and that's the Electoral College. Because our founders never intended on a pure democracy, they brilliantly created the Electoral College. I put these popular vote figures on the slide just to demonstrate my point about the Electoral College a little bit. I'm going to use some points made. I linked the article here by somebody named Tara Ross, and the title of the article is How the Electoral College Helps Protect Against Voter Fraud. Well, the first thing she has here is, with the Electoral College in place, an election cannot be stolen unless a few factors come together simultaneously. First, at a national level, the election needs to be close enough that altering the results in only just one or two states would change an outcome. Second, the margin in those contested states must also be very close. Such elections are fairly rare. The election in 2000 was one such election. Florida could have changed the outcome, and the margin in that state was vanishingly small. The third, and maybe the hardest to meet, assuming that the election is close, dishonest actors must be able to predict which state or states will be close enough to influence the final results. This is harder than it sounds, according to this writer. In 2000, no one could have known in advance that a few hundred stolen votes in Florida could change the election outcome. So while the Electoral College does provide us some protection from voter fraud, it doesn't mean that our election integrity could not be massively improved. And we also have to remember that local elections are not protected the same way as our federal elections, or our election for president with the Electoral College. They can be very much impacted by voter fraud, and in fact all of the cases that were listed in that article I was talking about earlier for elections that were affected by voter fraud were local elections. But that's where it begins. I mean, if you can manipulate local state elections, you're manipulating the whole system. And it's something that we really need to take a look at. And so, make no mistake, voter fraud dilutes the votes of honest voters. And as a country, we should be taking steps to ensure that American elections remain free and fair. I hope that this was something that you enjoyed watching, and thanks for listening. I appreciate it.